Welcome to Reconnected. This is where we listen to stories from spinal cord tumor survivors. We aim to provide connection between survivors by telling our stories. Our purpose is to increase awareness about what life is like after being diagnosed with an intramedullary spinal cord tumor. Because our diagnosis is so rare, it is hard to find information from the patient perspective. At Reconnected, we talk with people living with the diagnosis and surviving the surgery. My name is Dawn Standera, and I'm a survivor of a C1, C2 intramedullary ependymoma. That's spinal cord tumor lingo for a tumor inside my spinal cord right at the tip top of my spine. Today, we get to hear Liz's story. Welcome, Liz. Welcome from Ireland.
Thank you. Well, I'm in Wales.
Oh, you're in Wales. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Thank you for the clarification. Welcome. So when were you diagnosed, Liz, and where was your tumor?
So I was diagnosed in March 2021. So we were still sort of in the middle of COVID then at the time, which made things more difficult. My tumor was T8 to T10. So it's kind of about where your bra strap goes across the back. And it was a complete and utter shock, really, because I'd had absolutely no symptoms prior to being diagnosed. So how I got diagnosed was just an incidental finding, really. I've had a back problem since I was 21. I slipped on a wet floor at work and crashed down on my coccyx area. And I ended up with something called spondylolisthesis, which is where one vertebrae sort of slips in front of the other. Unbeknown to me, I'd been born with a bit of a defect there anyway. So I suffered on with that for many years until I got into my 50s. And I was seeking help for that because it had just got unbearable and I was having problems walking because of that. So I had an MRI in March 2021 to look at what needed to be done there. And I eventually had a lumbar fusion for that. But before I had the lumbar fusion, I had the MRI and I was called back the next day for another MRI for my whole of brain and spine. And I just thought, because I've never been ill, they just needed a different view, which was a bit naive of me, really, but I didn't know. And nothing was said by the radiographer. And then 3 days later, I sat in front of the neurosurgeon, who was a lovely man. And if you're going to have bad news, he was the one to tell you. And then he started talking about my lower back. And I thought, oh, it's okay. You know, it's all right. And then he moved the screen over and I could see this white tumor. I knew what it was. I mean, I could see it. I knew exactly what it was. I'm not a nurse or anything, but I could see this thing inside my spinal cord and it was filling the entire space. When they took it out, it was 4 centimeters long, but it was filling from side to side. And he looked at the MRI and he looked back at me and he said, "Are you sure you've got no paralysis, no numbness? Are you sure you've still got full function of your bladder and your bowel?" And I was puzzled and I said, well yes, I'm fine. I've got no problems with it. And he said, "It's a ticking clock." So that's how I found out about it, really. And it was just such a shock because that's not what I'd been expecting at all.
Yeah, nobody is. How could you? Had you ever heard of a spinal cord tumor before you had one?
No,
Neither.
not at all.
So it was T8 to T10, and it was 2021 when you got diagnosed. And was it the same year? How soon between being diagnosed and having surgery?
So I had the MRI on the 21st of March. And then I was diagnosed 3 days later. And I had the surgery on the 7th of July. So it was a couple of months.
I'm looking at my account, my calendar, and that's 2 years ago. This week. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It is.
So tell me about the surgery. One of the things, I'll just pause for a second and say, Liz was one of the people that wrote a chapter for our book, Reconnected. Thank you for doing that. I reached out to you, I remember, because you had posted in I think it was the Spinal Cord Tumor Association Facebook
Yes,
page. You had written what I felt like was a really compelling description of what it was like sensory wise after surgery.
yes.
Maybe I thought it was really compelling because it really mirrored what my experience was like. So um,
Mm.
I reached out to you and asked you, would you share that information for this chapter? And at the time that you wrote it, you were maybe what, 9 months post-op, I think. Does that sound about
Oh,
right?
I'm probably less than that even.
Less than that. Oh, okay.
Yeah, probably less than that. And the reason that I wrote that and that I posted it in the group was because I had had no information whatsoever. The only thing that was said to me before I had the surgery was having this surgery is going to make you worse than you are now. And that was it. I had no information. And I know it's difficult because everybody's experience is going to be different. Everybody's sensory or recovery or you know whatever is going to be different, isn't it? So I know it's difficult for them to sum it up and say this is how it's going to feel like, but just something, anything, just any explanation. And the very
Mhm.
fact that cutting into your spinal cord is going to give you a spinal cord injury, that would have been really helpful because I I remember coming round from the surgery and I was asleep and then I was awake really suddenly. Um, and there was the surgeon sticking his little needle in my toes to see
Yeah.
what I could feel. But it was just an overwhelming sensation of buzzing, and I felt like I'd been plugged into the electricity. It was just, yeah, overwhelming, and I
Mhm.
just couldn't get my mind to stop thinking about it. Um, and then they managed my pain. They took me back to the ward, and then going from being a really independent professional person, you know, I was an inspector with the Care Inspectorate Wales, going around inspecting care homes. Before that, I'd been a social worker, and going from that to being extremely independent and ambulant to needing two people to move me anywhere in the bed was such a shock. I'd never been ill. I'd never been in hospital, you know, and I had, because I didn't have any symptoms prior to the surgery, I walked into theatre and hopped up on the bed and came out not able to walk, and then had to learn to re-walk with very different legs.
I think I can relate to that so much because I am a nurse, and I was
Yes.
astounded by how overwhelmed I was when I woke up.
Mm.
I remember similar things, the buzzing. I remember feeling like there was almost a cushion of static around my body. And even I could feel people touching that area around my body before they actually touched my skin. And
That's right.
I remember the neurosurgeon, poking me, and I was so tickled. Yes, I can feel something sharp, but it feels like you're
Mm.
poking the person next to me. It doesn't
Yeah.
feel like it's my leg. And
No.
so it's one of the reasons I wanted to write a book and wanted to share what my experience was like so that nobody had to wake up from surgery
Mm.
so unaware of how strange it could possibly be. Of course, everybody wakes up a little different, but I think what you and I experienced is common.
Yeah. And it's shocking.
Mm.
I felt in a state of shock by it because I'd had literally no information. And that's why I posted in the group, because I said to the surgeon afterwards, you know, I said, it would have been really helpful if you could have told me something, anything, just to sort of prepare me in some way for what I might experience. And he said, write your experience down. He said, write it for me. So I did. And that's when I thought, well, I'll post it in the group because, you know, somebody might benefit from it.
Yeah. Oh, and they certainly
Yeah.
have. I
So,
did. I was wonderful for me to read that I wasn't the only person that
mm,
had such an overwhelming, there was a few things that I highlighted that were just reflected my own experience. So your legs felt like compression socks, booties, and alternate leg inflation. Oh, the compression socks, the SCDs,
Oh,
added
oh
to the
gosh, yes.
unfamiliar feeling in the legs. Yeah. And when you talk about you managed to stand with a special walking frame, take a few steps up the ward, but it was a very strange sensation as I could not feel the floor. It felt as though I was hovering or standing on balloons.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
And
so
to be honest,
disorienting.
even even nearly 2 years later, it still feels like I'm hovering. You know, I've as much as you can get used to it, I've got used to it now, but it still feels like that. I still can't feel the floor. I don't think I'll
How
ever feel
far
the
off
floor
are
now.
you
I think
closer to the floor now than you were?
yes. Oh gosh, yes. I'm closer to the floor, and I think I I tend to be quite heavy-footed on the floor now, and I think it's because I benefit from the vibration that I know I'm touching the floor because I can feel the vibration going up my leg. Does that make sense?
It does. And I will, just to give you hopefully some hope. I'm in my 8th year now after surgery. And in the 4th year, I started being able to feel my feet on the floor. So
Oh, really?
yeah, I fully feel my feet on the floor now. There are occasions when I'm overtired that I start to float up a little bit again, and then I realize,
Mm,
oh, I've done too much. It's time to back off. But most of the time, I feel my feet on the floor now, and I can feel
mm.
my rear end touching the seat now. It doesn't feel like I'm sitting on a ball
Oh,
anymore.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, mine still does, and it feels sometimes it feels really unsteady, like you're going to fall off.
I know. I always
But
feel like I was sitting
one
on
of
a
the
giant
things as
roller ball.
well, yeah,
Um,
absolutely. One of the things as well is just this heaviness. It's like it's like dragging bags of lead around. My lower legs just feel so heavy, and
yeah.
it's exhausting. And I think what you said about if you've done too much and you get too tired, you've only got so much stamina. There's something called the spoon theory that I read about how many spoons of energy you've got in a day.
Mhm.
And you know, your average person may have 20 spoons of energy, but we may only start off with 5 spoons of energy. And so we have to be really careful with how much we do. And I
Mhm.
definitely noticed if I've overdone it, I just, all the sensations feel much worse.
I have the same experience, and I've heard that spoon theory, and I use it. I think of it in
Mm,
terms of pacing. If I have 5 spoons and I have 5 important things to do, then that's
mm.
all I'm going to do. There's no more spoons
Yes,
after those 5 important things. Or if
no,
there's
you
three
do
important
really have to
things,
pace yourself.
yeah, yeah, pacing I think is key. And I also find that getting horizontal gives me relief if I start feeling that way. I think
Definitely.
my theory, I'm just my own theory is that. So you talked about, I think what you said about cutting into the spinal cord, causing a spinal cord injury is really key. Because when I realized when I was discharged from the hospital, I was diagnosed with quadriplegia, even though I could use
Mm,
my arms and legs, but I was an incomplete quadriplegic. That's my diagnosis. And that it was a non-traumatic spinal cord injury. Um, traumatic
yes,
spinal
if
cord injury
somebody
would be the cataract. Yeah.
if somebody had explained that to me, that would have made a massive difference, because it took me about 4 or 5 months really for that to click into place in my brain, that I was looking for help and support by looking for information about spinal cord tumors. But if I'd been looking for help for people with a spinal cord injury, I would have found the help and support, because the sensations and everything, you know, that's what I was feeling. And when I eventually found something called the Backup Trust, they're based in London, and I spoke to people from there, they had the same, and they have a walkers group as well, which is brilliant for people with incomplete injuries. And they were a
Hmm.
massive sense of support for me. You know, they it was still we were still coming out of the pandemic and things like that. So they had online support and some courses to go on, and they had a support group once a fortnight online, and that was just a lifeline for me. It really was. But that realizing that it was a spinal cord injury, that was massive for me. And although I was under a spinal team, there was no aftercare for me at all. I was sent home after 2 weeks with a walking frame and a pair of crutches in a house where I've got 3 floors, so 2 flights of stairs. I've got steps front and back outside as well. And I can remember standing at the bottom of my staircase and just looking up the staircase and thinking it was like Mount Everest. I was never going to be able to get up there, and yeah, so it was a lot, really. My daughter was fantastic, but she was only 18, and she was the person I got support from mostly in the beginning. The first 4 months before I realized that it was a spinal cord injury, then I actually got quite depressed, because I was contacting my local GP and saying, look, I think my legs are turning to stone. That's how they feel. They feel like they're turning to stone. And he was just saying, well, contact your neurosurgeon. And then I'd ring there to speak to the secretary, and nobody would ring me back. And I was just being passed from pillar to post, and nobody seemed to help me. So the inpatient care, I wasn't on a spinal ward or anything like that because of COVID. I was on a general surgical ward. A lot of the staff had never worked with spinal patients before, but I have to say all the staff were fantastic. My inpatient care was brilliant. I couldn't fault any of the staff, but then I was sent home with nothing. And I got quite depressed.
It's a tricky thing. I think that I get contacted by people fairly regularly when they've been diagnosed. And one of the things that I suggest when they are wondering where to go is not only to check out the neurosurgeon, but to check out the facility where they'll be having the surgery, to see how many spinal cord tumor patients have had surgery there. Because even where I had surgery, even though there's a fair amount of for any, maybe a dozen a year, which isn't a lot, but in spinal cord tumor world, that's kind of a lot. I still ran into physical therapists who'd never taken care of a spinal cord tumor patient. And when I came home, I didn't have any physical therapists in my town who'd ever taken care of a spinal cord tumor patient. So I was an experiment, really. Everybody doing their best. Everybody, like you said, fantastic and supportive, but we're just so rare. So I've often advised, if possible, to, if you're in an area where there's more than one facility, to see, is the physical therapy department equipped to handle us?
I think it's different in Britain as well, because we don't necessarily have the choice as well. I did have some physiotherapy when I came out after about 6 weeks. But the physiotherapist I had, she'd never worked with anybody with my sort of injury or diagnosis before, and she was fascinated. And I gave her your first book, and she read it, and she lent it to other people in the team there, and they found it fantastic. And she really benefited from that and was able to work with me better having read it. She read it in one night, I think.
That's a good physical therapist, seeking information.
Yeah. But I felt as well that I was a bit of an experiment as well. And she did help. And I did have a bit of hydrotherapy as well. It did help. It's just more the information side of things just wasn't there for me. And I still have never met anybody face to face to talk to who's had a spinal cord tumor, because they're so, few and far between, really. You're the first person I've ever spoken to face to face.
I remember the first person I met face to face, when she came to the door. She'd had a C1, C2 surgery. When she came to the door, I was so aware of how disorienting it must be for people in my life, because she looked perfectly normal. She walked right up to the door. She didn't have a limp. Her gait wasn't altered. Her head was held high. She was using her arms and legs. and I'd spoken to her on the phone. So I knew that she had all the sensory challenges that we have, but looked perfectly normal on the outside. And it startled me at how disorienting it was to be aware of how I knew she was feeling, but that how she appeared looked so different. And I guess it gave me some compassion for people in my life. My husband, of course, is more aware of, oh gosh, I can't feel my feet
Yes.
today, and those things. But my coworkers and friends who just sort of think I'm over it because I'm
Oh,
functioning so well. Yeah, it
absolutely.
helped
Yeah.
me have compassion for how of course they're going to see that I look perfectly normal. Do you find that now, and that people are thinking you should just be past this?
Definitely, especially my business partner, who obviously, we run a business together. We started it the year before I had my diagnosis, and she just very quickly wanted me to be back and fully involved in the business. And I was just, well, I can't, I don't feel well enough. I don't feel up to it. I mean, I am involved in the business now, but I still feel like I need to pace myself. And if I've done a lot one day, the next day, I might need to have a bit of more of a lie down during the day. But yeah, I mean, she looks at me, and I'm sure she looks at me and thinks, well, she's back to up to speed now. She's fine, because you can't see it. It's
Mhm.
very difficult having an invisible disability. And I have a friend who has a brain tumor, and she has the same sorry, not a brain tumor, a brain injury, and she has similar sort of things to what I do as well, in that she gets disoriented, etc., and people can't see it, and they expect more of her than she can actually manage. So there's a lot of similarities between her condition and my condition. So yeah,
Are
it's
your
difficult.
arms affected at all, Liz?
No, because of where mine was, it's because it's everything below, isn't it? Below the tumor. I get it really, for me, it's more from the belly button down. That's where my sensory issues are. I have no feeling in my buttocks, between my legs, down my thighs, or to the tips of my toes. It's when I say no feeling, it's bizarre. It is feeling, but it's not feeling. It's a strange thing to
That's
explain,
right.
really.
And I'm
It
thinking
is really
about
weird.
the person who's watching this right now who hasn't had surgery yet. And if they're anything like me before surgery, I would want to know, what are you talking about? It's like feeling, but not, and I don't know that there's any way to describe it that's useful,
The,
because there's no
if
frame
some
of
if
reference.
somebody could have no if somebody had tried to describe to me before the surgery how I was, because I know I keep saying I wanted information, but if somebody had tried to tell me, I don't think in a million years I could have actually really understood what they were talking about. The funny thing about my legs is that I can feel a ticklish touch, but a hard pressure touch I can't feel.
Hmm. That's interesting, because after surgery, it's different now, much different 8 years out. But after surgery, I couldn't stand the light touch. It lit my whole body up, just lit me up. And so I would
Mm,
tell people, if you're going to touch me, it needs to be a grab. It
mm.
needs to, I'm coming in and I'm going to touch you, and it needs to be a grip. Or else that was the only way I could tolerate any touch at all for a while, even clothes, fabrics,
Oh
sheets
yes,
on the bed.
I do have a problem with that. I have mostly it's everything from my belly button down that has the issue, but I have around my ribs,
Mm,
from where my scar is, right the way around my ribs. I get this feeling like neuralgia. It's a bit like having shingles, and I just can't bear anything touching it sometimes.
mm, mm,
And
yeah, the altered
that's not gone
sensation
away.
is, the altered sensation is overwhelming. So you're 2 years out now. What is year 2 like compared to year 1?
it's a lot better. I found ways to do things. You know, you find your own ways to manage, don't you? And how much rest you need to have, how much you can do. My balance has got better because my balance was very bad. But my balance has got better. And I think that's a lot to do with I go swimming a lot. At least 3 times a week I go swimming, and I do aqua aerobics, and it's really, really helped with my balance.
That's
I
a great
also
tip.
I like dogs, so I had a dog anyway, but I've recently got myself another dog because that encourages me to walk more. And whilst walking is difficult, and I've got, as I say, a spinal fusion as well, and I get pain from that, so walking is quite difficult. But having 2 dogs, I have to go out and I have to do it. So I'm quite a stubborn person, so I don't let a lot stop me, really. I think being stubborn and being really, you know, not wanting to let it beat me has been a really good thing. And having a positive attitude as well, because when I got the diagnosis, I thought, and I didn't know whether it was going to be malignant or not at that point, for, you know, for months, really. For about 4 months, I didn't know. But I thought, okay, you can either do this with a miserable attitude, which is going to affect everybody else, or you can do it with a smile on your face. So I chose to do it with a smile on my face. And when I was in hospital, all the other patients were saying, oh, do you know, it's so nice to wake up every morning and see your smiling face there. And that made my day then, because I was helping other people who had other issues, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think a positive attitude really helps.
I think bar every single person that I've met that has had a spinal cord tumor is tough as nails. I haven't
Yeah.
met anybody who has gone through this that didn't start out tough and end up tougher. Uh,
Mm.
yeah, so we can pat ourselves on the back for that, I think.
Yeah.
Um, I
And you
do.
know, I always think there are people worse off as well. You know, it could have been so much worse for me. You know, I'm still walking, albeit with difficulty. I'm still walking. I'm still doing stuff. You know, it could have been that the ependymoma wasn't, you know, it could have been something a lot worse. I didn't end up having to have radiotherapy or any of that. I didn't end up in a wheelchair. I'm lucky in comparison to a lot of people, and I know that. And when I'm having a down day, I just try and remind myself, look, you know, you're still here and you're still alive, you're still walking, you're lucky.
Thank you for your observations. It's been really fun to talk with you. Before we go, can you talk a little bit about what it's meant to you to, well, we've already touched on it, but that connection with the group, I think I can't, tell us the name of the group again with the people with the incomplete spinal cord injury in case
So
anybody
that was,
watches this and wants to connect.
yeah. So they're called the Backup Trust, and they're based in London.
Okay.
And they were just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And there were people in the support group as well. I set up a WhatsApp group as well for support for people in between the 2 weekly online support, and that's still going, and people are really, you know, really make use of that. But no, it meant everything to me, really, because just for people to understand. And although Backup Trust, there were people there with spinal cord injuries from traumatic injury, and there was me, there was, you know, there were other people who'd had spinal cord tumors as well, and
Oh,
there was
great.
people who'd had spinal cord strokes, and, you know, all sorts of things that I'd never heard of, but all
Right.
ended up with the same sort of sensory issues. So whilst I didn't find a group that was particularly and specifically for people with spinal cord tumors, because they all had spinal cord injuries from different things, we all had a common, you know, common sensory issues and common challenges in life. So it was fantastic. I think, well, it brought me out of a deep depression, to be honest with you.
And thank you for being a part of writing a chapter for Reconnected. That was so important to me to offer a viewpoint from one other than myself.
Mm.
As I wrote in the preface, after I wrote Rewired, people were contacting me and wondering, well, you had a cervical tumor, I'm going to have a thoracic tumor. What's my experience going to be like? And I just didn't know, because how would I know? So thank you so much for being somebody that wrote for the book that talked about specifically, in my opinion, the best description of what it's like to wake up from surgery and how to anticipate the strangeness of that, and to know that changes, and to get a longer viewpoint of that you're going to wake up and it's going to be the weirdest thing probably you'll ever experience in your life, but it'll shift and change, and also to be representative of the thoracic tumor world. So thank you, Liz. Thank you so much for being here today, for helping us connect, and for being a part of the book. I appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you, Dawn.
Okay. Talk soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.